Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast. This is episode 6, and today we're going to be talking about common terms used in sourdough, what they mean, and just kind of get in depth with that. So thank y'all for joining me today. We're going to start with what a sourdough starter is. You may hear the term wild yeast or natural yeast, and that is pretty much what a sourdough starter is. So when you make your sourdough starter, it develops and it captures yeast that's in the air, on the flour, maybe on your hands. If you ferment a lot, it'll be a quick process. If you don't, it can take a little longer, but you're capturing yeast. And so when you make bread with sourdough starter, it's the same as using regular yeast, except it's a natural, longer process. And so that's where you'll hear like wild yeast, because that's pretty much basically what a sourdough starter is. And so that's where you'll hear natural yeast, wild yeast, and it's kind of interesting, like the history of active dry yeast. All that they did was just isolate the yeast from a sourdough starter. So a sourdough starter will have wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria. And so what they do is they isolate the yeast from all the rest and dry it out. And that's how you get your yeast. It's kind of concentrated and it will work a little faster, but you don't get the flavor and you don't get the health benefits of the long fermentation. So that is the first term, natural yeast or wild yeast. Now we're going to get into the more common terms that you will hear. The first one is active or mature starter. Some people even say fed or ripe starter. What I usually say is for active sourdough starter, it is starter that has been fed. If it's on the counter, if you don't refrigerate it within the last 24 hours, it should have bubbles and it should have a pleasant smell. If you put it in the fridge like I do, I would say it should have been fed within the last 4 to 5 days and you should be fine. Active starter is the stage of a starter that is best suited for recipes that need a big rise. So like bread, of course, and anything like rolls, dinner rolls, anything that needs a good rise so that when you bake them, they get puffy and airy on the inside. You want to use active fed starter. Although I do use discard starter sometimes, which we're going to get into, and I still get good results with that. It may just take a little bit longer. So it's not that you can't rise dough with unfed or discard starter, but for best results, you want to use an active, somewhat active at least, starter so that it works a little more quickly and you get a more airy loaf. And that leads into sourdough discard. This is like the most misleading of all the terms in sourdough, and that is discard, because it sounds like you throw away starter, and that's not true. Really, I like to call it unfed starter or hungry starter. So sourdough discard is just starter that hasn't been fed recently. It may have been a week, it may have been 10 days, and what you'll notice is a grayish, sometimes almost black looking liquid on top. That's called a hooch. And a really strong acetone smell like nail polish remover. And that is hungry starter. You can use that in a ton of different recipes, and it still works fine for those like biscuits, tortillas, pasta, pie crust, muffins, scones. My biscotti recipe, you can use that with it. Things like, I have a sourdough breakfast skillet that uses discard or hungry starter. There's so many recipes that you can use that type of starter in that you don't really need to be concerned with wasting it or throwing it away. You can make pancakes. I could go on and on. There's so many recipes. There's actually more recipes that you can make with hungry starter than with the fed and active starter, because those recipes don't require big rise. And to be honest with you, most of us, I think most of us, because I get this question a lot, have more times when we have unfed starter than when we have fed starter. And because, there's that window of time when you feed your starter, when it's good and active and bubbly and yeasty smelling. And then most of the time, my starter smells like acetone and has the liquid on top because I don't feed it every day. Now, if you feed yours every day, then of course you're going to have more active starter. But the discard is misleading. You don't really discard it. You use it in recipes that don't require a big rise. And there's so many recipes that you can use sourdough discard for. So I always feed my starter up, knowing that if I don't get around to making bread, enough during that more active stage, I can make biscuits, I can make roll or pizza crust, or I can make pancakes or something like that and be fine. All right, so the next term that you will hear, this is the one I get the most questions about, is bulk fermentation. Okay, so my battery died and I'm going to be kind of mid-sentence. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I look different because I didn't have a battery charged. And so I'm on a whole new camera now. So we were talking about bulk fermentation. I get the most questions about bulk fermentation than I do any other part, I think, when it comes to baking bread. How do you know when the bulk fermentation is, done? And how do I know when to shape it and put it in the second rise for the second rise? Bulk fermentation is just the same as when you make yeast bread and the first rise, that's the bulk fermentation. It's when the whole lump of dough is fermenting or rising. And if you're making like 2 loaves, you let the full dough rise the first for the bulk fermentation, and then you can cut it in half when you get ready to shape it. And so bulk fermentation means the whole dough is going to rise before the second rise. And so it's really the first rise. I think it's just easier to say the first rise. But that's a common term, bulk fermentation. Fermentation is the process that's happening during that rise. So the sourdough starter is munching on the flour from the dough that you made, and it will build up carbon dioxide, and that's the bubbles, and that's the rise. And so that's the fermentation process. And then you will have a second rise. And then some recipes, I have same day recipes, and they only have one rise. And so it's kind of confusing to say, bulk fermentation if you do like just one rise. I suppose that one is the bulk fermentation, but I find it simpler to just say the first rise and the second rise, or just only one rise, because we're kind of used to those terms, first rise, second rise, and things like that. So bulk fermentation, though, is a first rise, and it is the time when the fermentation process happens, when that sourdough starter is eating on the flour from the bread dough and creating the carbon dioxide for that big rise. All right, so I have these wrote down. The next one is a cold fermentation. I am just really getting into cold fermented doughs. I am loving the flexibility of being able to put my dough in the fridge whenever, and it will still rise just really slowly. And then I have all of this time that I don't have to think about it, and when it's convenient for me, I can take that dough out of the fridge and take care of it. And I am getting more and more and more into this. I have been putting my artisan bread dough in the fridge way earlier than I ever have before. And just when I'm ready, I will bake it off, whether it's the next day or 2 days or 3 days or whenever. I don't have to worry about looking after it so much. And so I have really got to where I mix a lot of doughs up and just put them in the fridge. So if I make something like biscuits, I just mix it up, put it in the fridge, and then when I can think about it, I get it out and take care of it. And so cold fermentation, or an extended cold fermentation, really amps up the flavor as well. You're going to get a lot more of that sourdough flavor if you do a really long cold fermentation, whereas if you do a shorter fermentation that's on the counter or in a warm place like a proofing box or something like that, you get less of that sourdough flavor. And so I just love the flexibility of the cold fermentation. I never really got into it until like the last few months, and I am just really using my fridge a lot. Now, we have a room that we keep closed off. Our big pantry is closed off, and it gets really cold. And so I can put my doughs in there and not take up room in the fridge and just leave them. I could leave them in there for 2 or 3 days and they'll be just fine. And I can just bake them off whenever I want to. So I think cold fermentation is underused a lot. I think that if once you get into it and you realize how flexible that it makes sourdough, I think that you'll use it a lot more. From the time that you mix up your doughs and you do your stretch and folds, anytime after that stretch and fold, you can put that dough in the fridge. And you could go ahead and shape it and put it in the fridge and it will rise in there, or you can just put the dough in there and then take care of it later, whenever you want to. And I love that. I love that flexibility of the cold fermentation. I know I said flexibility a lot. Sorry about that, but that's what it is. That's the only word I can think of. All right, so those are some of, like in process terms. Let's talk about after it has fermented and some of the terms that are used, like the shaping, the banneton basket. So shaping is when you take it from that first rise and then you shape it into whatever shape that you're wanting, whether it's in a loaf pan or in a basket or just a bowl. I use colanders, sometimes just whatever you have. If you want a round shape, or if you want an oblong shape, or if you want loaf shape, you shape it. And then you put it in that vessel that's going to hold its shape so that when you go to bake it, then you don't have to worry about it losing that shape. And so let's say you want a round shape. I just like to take it out of the bowl and put the top side down on the workstation, and I like to pull all of the corners in all the way around into the center of that dough, turn it over and drag it against the table to build some surface tension, which is really important for that rise in the oven when you get ready to bake it. And then I put that smooth side, top side, down in a basket that's floured and just kind of tighten it up on the seam and put it in the fridge, and whenever I feel like it, I get it out and I bake it. The longer that I go, the more flavor it has. The shorter I go, the less flavor that it has. But it's more about just the convenience for me. Now, talking about baskets, banneton baskets, you hear that proofing baskets. Number one, I have had this question about baking in the baskets. You can't bake in them. They're just for holding the shape when you get ready to bake it. But they do make silicone proofing banneton baskets, and you can actually bake in those, which I find so interesting. I've never done it, and I really just recently found out about it. So, but apparently there are silicone baskets that you can bake in. I have had a few people on the Sourdough Can Be Simple Facebook group say that they have one and they use them for that. It's also non-stick, which is really nice, so you don't have to worry about it sticking to the basket. But there are options. You don't have to buy like a special basket to proof your dough for the second rise. You can use a medium-sized colander. Works really well because it has holes in it and it has some air and it can breathe. That works like perfect. And you can just put like a tea towel, cotton or linen tea towel in that medium-sized colander and just put flour in there and let it rise in that, and it works perfect. But I've even used just bowls, just like a medium-sized bowl, and I put the dough in there and with a towel lining it, and it works just fine as well. So you don't have to have like the special like quote unquote banneton basket. But, it's nice because you have it just that one use. And they also have like ridges, which give a pretty shape to the dough, or like design to the top of the dough. So now let's get into, before you bake it, scoring. So scoring just means that you are slashing the top of the loaf so that it can expand where you want it to expand. Scoring is not like necessary, as far as it will break somewhere. And so, it's not like if you forget to do it, that it's ruined. It will be fine, but it's just that the tear will happen. It'll crack and there'll be tears in places that you probably wouldn't want them to be. But if you score it, then it opens where you want it to. So like a simple slash down the top of the loaf, like straight down the top of the loaf, is fine. A cross, I do that a lot. A side score, just whatever that, you think, oh, that looks nice, then do that and it's fine. It'll work just fine. Now, there are two different types of scores. There are expansion scores, and then there are decorative scores, or design scores, which are not deep like your expansion score. They're just pretty, and they do like the wheat, or just little designs around the dough, and it just makes it pretty, and it's something you can be creative with. And if you want to get pictures for Instagram, you always want to do some designs and things like that. But the expansion score should go like roughly 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep. I go about, 3/4 of an inch is about as deep as I go. And I'm able to get an ear, which is what a lot of people, they want that. I don't get it as much as I used to years ago, when I would just make all-purpose flour sourdough bread. I would always get this ear, and it was beautiful. But with my freshly milled loaves, I get tiny little ear, but it's just not as big as the one that I get on the all-purpose loaves. So that is scoring. Now, to score, you can use a super sharp knife or a razor blade, just a straight razor blade. I do that a lot. Or you can use what's called a lame or a lom, and that's a razor blade, but it's on a stick, or it's held, so you don't have to hold the blade itself, and it has like a handle, and it's a little safer, so to speak. But I feel like I have more control just holding a razor in my hand. But definitely, I've had several cuts, throughout the years. And so, but I've never learned my lesson. I still use a razor blade most of the time. So, but loms or lames, they're really inexpensive. I think I paid less than $20 for the one that I have. And if you buy like a sourdough bread kit from Amazon, they usually come with one. And so you can get one with your kit. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is baking. There are two different methods to baking your sourdough bread. There's the preheated method and the cold bake method. So if you bake the preheated method, you're going to put your Dutch oven or your roasting pan, whichever you're going to use, into the oven and preheat it along with the oven. And when you take it out, it's going to be super hot with some steam in there. And when you drop the dough in there and put the lid back on real quick and put it in the oven, that steam builds and you get a better rise, because you don't want a crust to form until you've had a chance for that to rise all the way, because if you do, then you'll end up not getting so much of a oven spring. And so the cold method is just putting the dough in a cold Dutch oven or a baking vessel, putting the lid on, putting it in the oven, and preheating it. And I don't do that. I never have, but I have heard a lot of people get really good, similar, like almost the same results. And so if you want to save energy and do it that way, from what everyone's telling me, it works the same. I'm going to try it soon, and I'll have to let y'all know, like on the next episode, how it worked. But before I can even think about it, I'm already preheating my Dutch oven. And then I'll, like 20 minutes later, I'm like, oh yeah, I was going to try to do the cold method, but I keep forgetting. So I'm going to try to make a note and do that soon so I can let y'all know what the difference is. But yeah, those are some of the most common terms used in sourdough. Now, if I left one out that you want to know, then leave a comment and I will definitely throw that into the next episode. Well, 6 episodes in. This is awesome. This is the first time I've done video. I had someone say, why don't you just do video? And so I thought, well, at first I was like, oh, I don't want to, because, a lot of times I don't want to get myself ready for that. But then I got thinking, I watch the podcast better if there's a video too. So I was like, well, I may as well just start making a video. So if you're listening to this on Substack, I think you'll be able to see the video as well, but if not, you can head over to the YouTube channel, Rose Homestead, and click on podcast, and you can see it there. All right, well, that's all I have for y'all on this episode of the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast. We are coming up on Thanksgiving this week. I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving and a wonderful, beautiful time with your family and a wonderful meal. I'm going to be making sourdough dinner rolls for our get-together, and just looking forward to spending some time with those that we love. So, all right, well, thank you all so much for joining me on this podcast episode number 6, and we will talk with y'all really soon.